I'm really glad this is a morning session because if you put me on a couch in the afternoon, I'm just gone. Um, so basically, I was first asked to host this session on podcasting because I run a podcast called The Seen and the Unseen, which is sort of a podcast which looks at the seen and unseen effects of public policy. Fairly boring. Um, but I'm probably better known for blogging. In the last decade, I ran a blog called India Uncut, which was fairly popular back then. And over a period of 5 years, 2003 to 2009, when it was fairly active, I used to post 5 times a day, um, posted about 8,000 posts in that time, and I used to get about 20,000 page views a day on average. So it was a pretty well-known blog. But rather than talk about the nuts and bolts of either blogging, which I think is dead for reasons I'll come back to, but rather than talk about the nuts and bolts of blogging and podcasting, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about how I've seen the media space change for writers and readers in the last 20 years. Um, because one of the interesting things about being middle-aged is that you often one of the interesting things about being middle-aged is that a lot of the things that you take for granted, the ways in which you looked at the world and the experiences you had, are actually something that most young people are complete strangers to. So I want to talk a little bit about how we are different today from, say, 20 years ago in 1997, to A, how as readers we take in information and form our worldviews, and B, as writers, the kind of writing we have the scope to do. So, if you go back to 97, you just before the internet really got going and long before blogging really got popular, most of people's sources of information came from mainstream media. And mainstream media essentially had what you would call a broad consensus on the facts. There might be biases. You might say there's a liberal bias somewhere or a conservative bias somewhere, but there's a broad consensus on the facts. You're getting similar kinds of content, and they're acting as filters. One, filters for quality, which is good because you need those, but B, also filters for the types of worldviews that come in. And because they are all sort of broadcasting, reaching out to very large audiences relatively, the voices become the voices of generalists rather than specialists. How that changed with blogging was that as a writer, for example, I was a journalist before I became a blogger. Um, and as a journalist, if I, for example, wanted to be published in 1997, if I wanted to write an op-ed or if I wanted to express my opinion, I had a very set format, 700 to 900 words or whatever the format is. And I had to follow the newspaper's guidelines style. It had to be content that they wanted. I was subject to the biases or preferences of whoever is editing me, and so on and so forth. Um, I am read only in a limited geography, depending on what the newspaper or so on is. What blogging did was it disrupted all that. So, A, you had no disruptions. I mean, it put the tools of publishing in the hands of everybody. Anybody could suddenly get his writing out there and have a shot at getting the readership he or she feels they deserve. Uh, and a lot of the restrictions disappeared. For example, restrictions of length. I might have a single thought that I can express in 2 sentences, but if I try to express it in a traditional newspaper format, I have to unnecessarily expand it into 700 words or make an op-ed out of it or whatever. Blogging means a lot of my posts were a simple link to something and 3 or 4 lines of opinion, and that's it. It doesn't have to be longer than that. The flip side, blogging also allows you to explore nuance and go into depth. You can write a 3,000 word piece, a 4,000 word piece, or whatever. It's very interesting. I edit an online magazine today called Pragati, and I used to be a managing editor of Cricinfo for a few years in the 2000s. And one of the dogmas web editors always had was that you don't want the reader to scroll, you want it to be short. And I just found that was nonsensical. I thought the biggest advantage of being able to publish online was that you did not have those restrictions. And if your content was compelling, the reader would scroll forever. It doesn't matter. So all that matters so as an editor, the kind of pieces I look for in my magazine today, I always tell my writers, word length doesn't matter, readability does. So that was another of the restrictions blogging kind of removed back then. It removed restrictions of geography. You could write and be read anywhere in the world. It removed restrictions of having to wait for a certain period before your piece came out. If something happened at 9 a.m., I can comment on it at 9:15 a.m. and be read by people around the world. I don't have to follow the news cycle, which, and we almost take it for granted how everything is so immediate today. News breaks and, it's instantly all over social media and everyone knows what's happening. And mainstream media itself has changed its coverage in keeping with that. But it wasn't like that back in the day. You had these news cycles. For example, there's a great book by Walter Lippmann called Public Opinion. This came out in 1922. And the first chapter, which I'll refer back to later in this, is called The World We Live in and the World in Our Heads. And he talks about how there was an island in a particular place which was half English and half German, sort of. And for about, and they got news once a month when the ship came in. And they knew that they were at war with each other a month after the war had already begun. And so for that month, they're being completely friendly and everything is normal. And then they find that no, they have to, hate the other, so to say. And similarly, when World War I ended, the news took so long to percolate that more than 100,000 people died in battlefields after the war had ended because the news hadn't reached them. That's how long it took. And in this age of social media, that would never happen. Though you would probably have fake news which would cause 100,000 deaths anyway. So blogging removed restrictions of length, of format, of geography, of subject. You might be a specialist on a particular subject and yet it not get published in mainstream media because they try to keep it accessible and sort of general and so on. But as a blogger, you had all these specialist little ecosystems popping up. I mean, the one that I followed the most and was part of was the whole ecosystem of economist bloggers. Like, I don't know how many of you read Marginal Revolution, which is written by two economist friends of mine, Tyler Cowen and Alex Tabarrok. Yeah. So, sorry, all this while you couldn't hear me. Fair enough, sorry. Shall I start from the beginning? Yeah. So, blogging disrupted mainstream media in all of these ways. It removed restrictions of length, removed restrictions of geography, removed restrictions of having to follow the news cycle, removed restrictions of specialization, where specialists got published much more and managed to find an audience. And it was also a check on mainstream media itself, and B, it was a meritocratic space. You would eventually, hopefully, find the kind of audiences you deserved. You had a much better shot at finding the kind of readerships you deserved, and people were no longer therefore needed. People no longer needed to depend on the mainstream media either to express themselves, which anyone could do, and then let the market decide who they want to read and who they don't. Or as readers, you were no longer dependent on mainstream media for information and perspectives. You got a much wider range there. For example, if you were in the US in the 90s, you'd have the Wall Street Journal with its conservative slant and the New York Times with its liberal slant, and that's not all there is to it. There's just a world of nuance and opinion out there, and the blogosphere kind of catered to the long tail of opinion, as I call it. Now, towards the end of the last decade, what happened was, and why I say blogging died, is that social media killed blogging by taking over many of the functions of blogging. For example, in my blog, India Uncut, I used to do a lot of filter blogging, where you just link to stuff, link to interesting stuff, and if people generally agree with you or are sympathetic to your worldviews or your perspectives on things, and they come to you regularly and they check out what you're linking to. And Twitter killed that kind of micro blogging and filter blogging. Facebook killed, Facebook took over the personal space. And what it did was, even though in blogs, a lot of blogs had comments, but many didn't. Many of the high traffic ones like mine, we chose not to because the noise to signal ratio was out of whack. But even though a lot of blogs had comments and you had, blogs like Daily Chaos and HuffPo form little communities around them, broadly, following social media back then was a pretty passive experience. You could write anything you wanted at any point in time, but those conversations weren't really blooming in the same way that they are today. what happened with Twitter and Facebook was that it became much more active. Everybody became a participant because there's really no cost to putting out a 140 character tweet. And if you look at, for example, a lot of Twitter discourse, it's very shallow and it's very easy to be shallow. Snark is possibly the dominant mode of expression on Twitter, and it's again very easy to be snarky. You don't have to go into depth on anything. It's much easier to mock someone than to actually try and do cutting edge analysis. And I think all those different functions of blogs, whether it's in some cases the conversations they enabled, or the filter blogging, or the personal posts, all kind of got taken over by social media. And I want to come back to Walter Lippmann's essay at this point because this is something that's been bothering me for a while, and I'd like to open it up and see what some of you guys have to say. Prem Panikkar sitting here, I know he has some great thoughts on this. Lippmann's essay was called "The World as It Is and the World Inside Our Heads," and his thesis basically was that look, there's a real world out there, but everyone has a construct of the world inside their head. So if there are a billion people, there are effectively a billion worlds. And the reason I sort of spoke about how things have changed during these last 20 years is in 1997, let's say everybody in Bangalore would have broadly the same kind of world inside their heads. That's changed today because what social media has done is that social media has allowed people to connect across geographies and so on to people with interests like theirs and views like theirs. And what is also done is polarize the discourse. So it's very easy now to just form different echo chambers, and then the confirmation bias kicks in, and you ignore everything outside that echo chamber, and you are just stuck with the world that is inside your head, which could have a lot of fake news, which could have whatever. But you have, therefore, an ecosystem of not just one or two or three big echo chambers, but literally millions of them overlapping and so on. And that makes fake news a much bigger problem today than, say, it was in Walter Lippmann's time, where the mainstream media would eventually form that consensus around what the facts are, which is almost impossible today. And I noticed this, for example, in the context of the last UP elections, where a lot of people who were devastated by demonetization, they lost jobs, they lost their businesses, nevertheless went and voted for Modi because there was a fatal disconnect between the world that they actually inhabited and the world that they chose to live in inside their heads. So, okay, yeah. So I'm pretty much done. I'll sort of throw to the audience right now, but yeah. So just to sum up the that unlike in the past, unlike say in unlike 20 years ago, there is now a disconnect between the world in our heads, in each of our heads, and the world that we actually live in. And it's very hard to kind of break through that because there is no more, not just a consensus on what the facts are, but even a consensus on where you get those facts from. And it's very easy to form your own little bubble or your own little echo chamber and sort of live within that. So I'm very happy to take questions on the nuts and bolts of blogging and podcasting, as it were. But I also thought that I should sort of throw out how the media environment has changed over these last 20 years and the ways in which we get, how we form the worlds inside our heads effectively. Any questions? Prem, you have any comments to add to this? We'll just take questions now. I'll let the mic come.
Just one quick observation and one quick question. So what I really foresee is that the foresight of WhatsApp groups particularly has spawned fake news, and I think people, like for example my parents, they would literally believe anything they see on WhatsApp. That's a really dangerous trend we're going forward because no one's really questioning who sent that forward, why did they send it forward. It could be a left-wing agenda or it could be a right-wing agenda.
Absolutely.
So that's one. My question are on the death of blogging. So if someone wanted to become a blogger right now, what format and what thought process should they think about if they really wanted to get into the space right now? From an Indian context, what would be the logical way to approach it is the question.
Uh, I think, when you write, if you want to write and get yourself out there, rather than think about what format will reach your audience the best, it's kind of better to think what format actually suits your expression and what you want to say the best. So back in the day when I started blogging, it was so attractive to me because of its flexibility. Because I could have a 50-word post, I could have a 3,000-word post, though I had many more 50-word posts and 3,000-word posts. So you kind of have to figure out what what attracts you more about each of the forms rather than think about audience, because audiences now in any case are very fragmented, and I am kind of skeptical about any kind of writing making a difference. That said, if you that said, blogging was incredibly useful to me because, like I said, I did about 8,000 posts in 5 years and so on. I was exercising my writing muscle every single day, so to say. And I think that for what it's worth, it made me just a much better writer because I was writing so much and writing so much in an unself-conscious way. Because I'm just putting it out there on the blog. I put so much out there. I don't really think hard about it. So the voice is much more natural and so on. While if you're writing an op-ed for someone or an essay for someone, you put a lot more thought into it and you care about what they think of it and so on, which you don't while blogging. So it's very chill that way. So I would just say that if you want to write or blog, don't think about your audience. Just you know.
Anyone on this side?
Hi, I follow your podcasts, and I was really hoping you would touch upon your podcast after you gave a very good linear.
Glad to do so now.
Yeah, but my question is, do you think podcasts would go the same way as the blog and the social media? In the sense, it's far easier to speak than write it out as well. Today, I see podcasts is still limited to more urban centers. I don't see that, but do you think going forward, it'll be far easier to just record something and put it out on the on the media rather than even I mean, writing would be more tedious.
I think if you look at how you consume audio content and written content, you can consume written content while you're doing other things. You can have four windows open and there's an article here, and you click on something on Twitter. Consuming audio content requires more more of a commitment. Now, so this is interesting because I used to be very skeptical of podcasting. So I partner for my podcast with these guys called Indusvox Media. So if you just hunt them out, they're an awesome network. They have some 20-25 Indian shows. They cover a lot of ground. And the guy who runs that, who's my partner on this, Amit Doshi, when he first got in touch with me and said, "Why don't you do a podcast for us?" And I said that there's no talk radio culture in India. Indians don't listen. It simply won't work here. And he shared some interesting statistics with me. He showed me that across the world, so studies have shown across the world, across cultures, geographies, markets, everywhere where there's audio content, where there's radio, 30% of the people prefer talk to music. Everywhere. And because it's everywhere, because it goes from Indonesia to US to across cultures and geographies, like I said, impressively in all the continents, I'm assuming that that is something, therefore, that is hardwired. It's not a cultural thing. And if it's hardwired, that means that even in India, there is that untapped market where a lot of people would listen to talk radio if they got good talk radio, but then it becomes a vicious circle. Because there is no good talk radio, no one listens to talk radio. So, at some point you kind of break that vicious circle, which Amit and IVM are trying to do. Um, so yeah, I'm a little less skeptical now, but I have to say that I am personally not one of those 30%. And I just prefer to zone out and listen to music. I don't listen to too many podcasts. Maybe when I'm working out, which I don't do enough, or if I'm commuting, then I might listen to something. So but that space is just wide open.
Can I take it here now?
Sure.
You mentioned about fake news. Just want to go back to that. So fake news is creating opinion. As consumers, you do not know what is fake, what is not. So what do you do? How do you manage? Because then ultimately you're creating opinions based upon wrong information. How do you filter out what is not right or right?
I think what happens is that in any healthy ecosystem where there are no barriers to entry, someone will take that role. For example, alt news, Pratik Sinha, they do a great job, and they came up because there was that demand in the market from people like us for someone to go out there and debunk the fake news and constantly do fact checks and so on and so forth. In a much earlier age in the US, there were Snopes, which would check all these, facts. But that was set up for a different purpose. What is happening here is far more sinister and insidious, and there are people who've taken it upon themselves to sort of do something about it. But the bottom line is people will believe what they want to believe. And there's an interesting story Pratik of Alt News told me a few weeks ago. which was about how there was a bit of fake news that was propagated. I forget exactly what. And he did a story where he traced it back to its source, which was some random website somewhere nobody had heard of. And after he published that the guy who published that website got in touch with him on WhatsApp and said, "I want to talk to you." So Pratik called him up and they spoke. And it turned out this kid was an 18-year-old kid. And he had started this website and he wanted AdSense hits. And he was just experimenting with different kinds of news to see what gets picked up. And it was this rabid Hindutva stuff which got picked up. Now, he wasn't funded by the BJP. This was not part of some top-down plan, let's create fake news. There was a market for it. And somebody supplied that market. And this makes me very pessimistic because there isn't a market for, there isn't such a big market for debunking. There is a market which sort of feeds your beliefs, and there does seem to be a lot of misogyny and bigotry and sexism in India, which is ingrained into us. It's part of our culture. It's part of who we are. That's just the hard truth. And that is the market. And therefore, you'll have more and more of this fake news coming up. And hopefully there'll be people fighting the good fight like Pratik and bloggers and whatever. But that's, to me, that's a big challenge. I don't have an answer to that. That when so many people, when there is a market for fake news, when people want to believe such stuff, how do you break that? I don't know.
So hi, I had a question regarding blogging versus podcasting. So while podcasting, we talk from our mind at heart at the moment. So let's say, is it as nuanced as blogging, where you have to do a little research for honest bloggers, that is, where you have to do a little research before writing down your piece, versus podcasting, where you just say what you think on the spot, or you might have done research too, but let's say you chart into unfamiliar territory. Like, is that a little bit dangerous compared to blogging?
Uh, I think it's practically the other way around. I do a lot more research for my podcast because I assume if someone is going to make that commitment of taking 20 minutes of his time and listen to my podcast, I have to give him something that's compelling. So I work much harder on my podcast than I did on my blogging, and a lot of my posts used to, tended to be very short and so on. So I don't think that's an issue, and I think ultimately you create your own credibility with the kind of work you do. So if someone is careless either in his blogging or his podcasting, that'll affect his credibility and vice versa. So
Hi. I just wanted to extend the question that was asked before in the fact that in an overcrowded space of opinions and interpretation of news, which includes traditional forms of op-eds in magazines, then YouTube channels and podcast, what is the future of podcast? Because the audience is very niche and it is a very homogeneous group of people. It's not very diverse. So do you think there's a future where it becomes more mainstream and has access to more people, or more people will show interest in it? Or will it die down slowly?
I don't know. I mean, I have the same question and no one to answer it. I mean, I don't think we know that. I think what guys like Amit of IVM podcast, Amit Doshi, are betting on is that a lot of us are wired to prefer talk to music. And therefore, if you give them good content, if you give them good talk radio, the culture will form. And that's how you break the vicious circle. You try and break it on the supply side first. Whether it'll work, I really don't know. But I don't see why not. But at what point does it reach that critical mass? I don't know. I think Prem finally has something to say.
Shall I?
No, I mean, this question gets asked a lot, and it's interesting that Amit is sitting here. Ask him how many times he heard the same question: what is the future of the internet? What is the future of blogging? What is the future of every single innovation we've had in the field of communication? Everybody goes, oh, yeah, it's working right now, but what is the future? You do well in the present, it has a future. You screw up in the present, it doesn't have a future. So, Amit is a living example, which is why I brought it up.
It's a very good question. I have the same question, so I wouldn't diss you for the question.
Comment actually. You mentioned that blogging is probably tapering down, but in a general blog sense, maybe in a personal blog, but if you're looking at niche blogs, for example, I'm interested in motorcycle racing or motorcycles, there it actually is taking up a bigger chunk of the media space than, say, a media magazine. So do you have any thoughts on that, on specific spaces?
Yeah, no, I should clarify. You're absolutely right that niche blogs will continue to flourish because they service a long tail of content, so to say. So they'll continue doing well. But I think blogs play a much smaller role in people actually getting the kind of information they do. And like I used to get emails from readers back in the day that we don't go to Times of India anymore or HT anymore. Every morning, like people from New Zealand and US used to write to me, we just come to India Uncut and we see what you're blogging there. And that is not possible today because your sources of news are so dispersed, and attention spans have also suffered. I mean, Twitter it changes the whole world into a world of bytes. So in that sense, for individual enthusiasts and for the long tail, blogging remains really important. But I don't think it has the same kind of greater appeal that it probably used to.
Hi, my question is on libertarianism. There is this massively shrinking space around that. How does one protect and grow that space? I know that you believe in it, and I'm one of the probably few people around who passionately believe in it. So, if it's a one-to-one question, sorry about that, but I wanted to know the answer to that. Thank you.
The libertarian space, dude, I'm very pessimistic. I don't think liberty is on the march. We live in very troubled times. So, beyond my pessimism, I don't really have much to share. But you know, one of the only thing that really makes me hopeful is that while in general governments are getting more and more powerful and oppression is growing, um, the big unknown out there is technology. There is still that hope in me that technology will continue to empower individuals and achieve liberal/libertarian ends where governments and activism can't, because technology is very disruptive and can go around all of that. So that is a hope, but it's a hope that is based on unknown unknowns, and it could work the other way. For example, social media has been extremely empowering in many ways, but it has also created these echo chambers which you cannot break through anymore, and has made fake news so prevalent and powerful.
Hi, you talked about world in our head and the world as it is. I believe I have my own individual biases, but I want to understand the daily news as the world as it is. Yeah. But I also find the mainstream media now extremely slanted. They have all taken extreme positions. I go to the internet, there also they are all on extreme positions. So how do I sort of understand the world as it is? Sort of living out this bias. It's getting really tough even to sort of make sense of the daily news as it is, right? So how do we sort of get through this?
I think that's a very well articulated question in the sense that we all have our own biases, obviously, and what we therefore tend to do is we tend to find the worlds and the media sources and whatever that conform to those biases, and then we use it to form a sort of a comfort zone around us, and we kind of stick to that. So that's what tends to happen. That's a human tendency. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, the mainstream media is not doing its job at all, and social media has become very polarized, which it wasn't like 10 years ago, but it's become that way because everybody has become very shrill, and when discourse is necessarily shallow as Twitter forces, then that's going to happen. And that's in fact one of the things that we tried to do with the magazine I relaunched earlier this year, Pragati, was that we will be bipartisan, and we'll do dispassionate policy analysis. We won't attack or support parties or people. We'll just focus on policies and so on, except for my impassioned editorials. So that's pretty much what we try to stick to. But which is why I shared what I shared at the start of this, because they lead to questions from me, not answers. So I really don't know. So I'm interested in what you guys think.